protein. Which autonomic division regulates the release of epinephrine from the adrenal medulla? So which one was that? Which one was that had an effect on the adrenal medulla? Was it sympathetic or parasympathetic? Sympathetic, right? Sympathetic, perfect. The second question here, which part of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic or parasympathetic, produces a more diffuse response and why? So sympathetic does, why would that be? Perfect, perfect. So as you correctly said, because this response allows hormones to be released into the blood, and that is going everywhere, okay? That's going to give you a more diffuse response. Okay, so let's move on to the receptors and neurotransmitters that allow these neurons to speak to one another. There are two types of receptors. There are cholinergic receptors, and cholinergic receptors bind acetylcholine. This I think you would have already been familiar with from Dr. Eder's lectures. And then there are adrenergic receptors, and adrenergic receptors bind norepinephrine, sometimes epinephrine. All right. Now, we're going to look at the location or which neurons actually secrete what neurotransmitters. So all preganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine, right? I want you to stick that in the back of your head. That doesn't change. All preganglionic neurons, so that's that first neuron, secrete acetylcholine, all right? And only parasympathetic postganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine. So all parasympathetic neurons secrete acetylcholine. Does that make sense? I'll say that again. So all preganglionic neurons will secrete acetylcholine, be it sympathetic or parasympathetic. But only parasympathetic postganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine. The parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are the ones that secrete acetylcholine. The sympathetic postganglionic neurons will secrete norepinephrine. Okay? And I have an asterisk here because there is one exception, and that's your sweat glands. So your sweat glands, their postganglionic neurons also secrete acetylcholine. Just an FYI, okay? You won't be responsible or tested on that, just to let you know that there is a small exception to that rule. All right, and I mentioned hormones at the bottom because again, once they enter the blood, these neurotransmitters become hormones. So the adrenal medulla chromaffin cells will secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, so let's point that out here. We have all preganglionic neurons secreting acetylcholine, right? And only, this is the sympathetic system, and all the postganglionic neurons will secrete norepinephrine or epinephrine in the case of the adrenal medulla. Is that clear? So for the sympathetic system, acetylcholine, norepinephrine. The parasympathetic system, everything secretes acetylcholine, right? Both the preganglionic and the postganglionic. Is that clear? Any questions on that? Okay. Now, there are two types of cholinergic receptors, right? So we said cholinergic receptors bind acetylcholine specifically. Now there are two subtypes. There are nicotinic receptors and there are muscarinic receptors, okay? And they differ slightly in the way that they function. So the nicotinic receptors are what we call ionotropic receptors. And all that ionotropic means is that the receptor also acts as a channel, okay? So when acetylcholine binds to that nicotinic receptor, automatically a channel opens the membrane depolarizes. It's a much faster response because it's all happening with one channel. The channel is the receptor. Okay. Now, on the contrast, your muscarinic receptors are different. These are metabotropic, which means that they have to be coupled to a G protein. So these are G protein coupled receptors. So when acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic receptor, right, there is another protein, another phosphorylation of another protein happening, and that's going to give you a different cellular response. That's going to take more time than an ionotropic receptor, right, because the receptor is different from the channel. Does that make sense? Right, and I think you would have done this with Dr. Eder as well. What's the difference between an ionotropic and a metabotropic receptor? Okay. Now let's look at the location of these cholinergic receptors. So your autonomic postganglionic neurons will have nicotinic receptors, right, along with your skeletal muscle. Whereas the effector tissues of the parasympathetic system will have your muscarinic receptor. So let's see what that actually means. All right, so we have our two neurons, right? Now, because we said all preganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine, right? Your postganglionic neuron is going to have a cholinergic receptor, right? It will be a nicotinic receptor, always, because all preganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine. On your effector tissue, right, of the parasympathetic system will be, let's say parasympathetic, will be a muscarinic receptor. This will always be a nicotinic. Whereas on the sympathetic system, this will be an adrenergic receptor because the postganglionic neuron is secreting norepinephrine. Okay, I want that to be clear. Are there any questions on that? So our preganglionic neuron secretes acetylcholine. It binds to a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. Our postganglionic neuron, in the sympathetic system, it will secrete norepinephrine, which will bind to an adrenergic receptor. In the parasympathetic system, it will secrete acetylcholine, but that will bind to a different type of cholinergic receptor. It will be a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. All right, any questions on that? Any questions? Okay. So I'll recap that again, just for the benefit of those who missed it. Your autonomic postganglionic neurons have nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Your skeletal muscle has nicotinic cholinergic receptors. The effector tissue of your parasympathetic system has muscarinic cholinergic receptors. And the effector tissue of your sympathetic system will have adrenergic receptors. Okay? So we'll move on to talk about the types of adrenergic receptors. Right? So there are two basic subtypes of adrenergic receptors. We have alpha receptors and beta receptors. And again, remember that these are coupled to G proteins. So they're going to be metabotropic. Underneath the alpha, we have alpha 1, alpha 2. Underneath beta, we have beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. Okay? And we'll look at those individually. So the alpha receptors are located mainly in the sympathetic nervous system and the effector organs. That's mostly where they're found. They're usually excitatory. What does that mean? They usually bring about an excitatory response at the cell. Okay? So increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate. Okay? And then they have a greater affinity for norepinephrine than epinephrine. So although both of these molecules, I remember I told you, both norepinephrine and epinephrine can bind adrenergic receptors, they have differing affinities. So the alpha receptors, they like norepinephrine better than they do epinephrine. So they have a greater affinity for norepinephrine. Any questions so far? All right. The beta receptors are a little different. These are going to use a second messenger system called cyclic AMP. And we're going to see exactly how that looks at most likely next class. But their second messenger is called cyclic AMP. And the beta receptors also have varying affinities, right? Varying affinities. So beta 2 likes epinephrine more than norepinephrine. Okay? So beta 1 is usually located in the heart and the kidneys. And again, it's usually excitatory. So increase or excite that tissue, right? And it has an equal affinity for norepinephrine and epinephrine. That's beta 1. Beta 2 is a little different. Beta 2 is usually inhibitory, all right? And it has a greater affinity for your epinephrine than your norepinephrine, so the opposite of your alpha receptors, okay? And we can find beta 2 on some blood vessels, right? And again, it's going to usually be inhibitory. Any questions so far? What questions do we have? Any questions? Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about the greater affinity for epinephrine or norepinephrine. How does the effect of these neurotransmitters differ?
The effect is the same, but there's more epinephrine in the blood than there is norepinephrine. You can also have the conversion of epinephrine to norepinephrine, so that's going to allow different tissues to pick up or to have a different response. I don't know if that makes sense. So if it has a better affinity for epinephrine, it'll more likely have a better response to that hormonal contribution or that hormonal influence. If it has a better affinity for norepinephrine, it'll most likely have a better response at the synapse level. Okay, does that make sense? All right. Any other questions? All right. And then lastly was beta 3. This is going to be located in your adipose tissue. Again, this is usually excitatory, and this has equal affinities for norepinephrine and epinephrine, sort of like beta 1.